You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of precision.
Right. It feels almost like engineering in a way.
Exactly. I mean, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor simply points to the monitor and says, well, there it is.
It's binary. You have a visible, point of failure, broken or not broken.
Yeah, and it's clean, it's undeniable, and it gives us this clear path forward.
And honestly, that clarity is comforting. Human beings desperately want threats to be visible. We want to categorize behaviors and dangers neatly into boxes so we can just apply a standard treatment plan and move on with our lives.
Right, but then you step out of the physical realm and into the behavioral landscape, specifically the world of predatory behavior, neurodevelopment, and, psychological trauma.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's where it all falls apart.
Suddenly, that X-ray machine is completely useless. You are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just entirely murky. It's much more akin to trying to track a highly sophisticated virus that is constantly mutating specifically to evade the host's immune system.
The virus metaphor is incredibly apt, really, because a virus doesn't just passively survive, it actively adapts to its environment.
It figures out a way around the roadblocks.
Exactly. When one pathway is blocked, it finds new vectors for transmission. It changes its camouflage. And that constant chilling adaptation is exactly what we need to dissect today.
So if you're joining us right now, you are stepping into a comprehensive, really unflinching deep dive into how predatory operations have evolved over the last 2 decades. We are basically tracing a behavioral mutation.
And we're going to examine how this specific type of predation morphed, from the chaotic, improvised analog days of early AOL chat rooms.
Which were just Wild West days.
Total Wild West. From there to the hyper-insulated, weaponized wealth of billionaires, and finally to the modern digital camouflage that is currently sitting in the living room of almost every family in America.
Right. Children's video games.
Yeah. The technology has shifted dramatically, but the underlying human psychology, the mechanics of the drive that compels this behavior, remains remarkably constant.
And to truly understand the sophisticated digital networks operating right now, we have to establish a baseline, right? We have to look backward at the friction point where the digital frontier first violently collided with physical law enforcement.
Yes, and our guide for navigating this timeline today is a massive, sprawling interview featuring legendary investigative journalist Chris Hansen.
Yeah, taken from his recent sit-down on the Julian Dory podcast, we are taking that raw data, the historical anecdotes, and the backstage realities to really unpack the sheer mechanics of these operations.
It's a goldmine of information.
It really is. And I promise you some surprising behind-the-scenes facts, intense, real-world case studies, and most importantly, the practical takeaways for how to actually defend against this in your own home.
So let's start at that initial friction point. Because when people think of modern sting operations today, they picture, mobile command centers.
Yeah, the whole CSI treatment.
Right. Highly coordinated digital forensics teams, SWAT elements, seamless communication. They picture this well-oiled machine.
But taking it back roughly 22 years to March 2004 in Bethpage, Long Island, the reality was the exact opposite. I mean, it wasn't a machine at all.
Not even close. It was a completely improvised experiment.
It was the genesis of a totally new type of investigation. And local police departments simply did not have the paradigm, the jurisdiction, or the resources to police the internet in this manner back then.
No, they were completely unprepared.
Let's paint the picture of this setup because it sounds almost absurd by today's standards. They rent a house in Bethpage. The house belongs to a retired NYPD cop. But at the moment this operation begins, there is zero active law enforcement involvement in the house.
None. No local police, no feds.
It is literally just a television crew, an online watchdog group called Perverted Justice, and a security guy named Ron Knight, who happens to be a former NYPD lieutenant, and the detail that really highlights how blind they were flying.
Oh, this is wild.
The very first thing Ron Knight does before a single suspect arrives is walk into the kitchen, take all the knives out of the drawers, and hide them.
He stripped the environment of immediate weapons because they had absolutely no psychological profile of who's about to walk through that front door.
Right, they were flying completely blind.
You have to remember, the watchdog group had spent weeks posing as underage users in rudimentary chat rooms. AOL, Yahoo, MySpace. They were casting a digital net.
But they had no idea what kind of physical reality that net would drag into the living room.
Exactly. And what they dragged in was a staggering volume of people. In just 2.5 days, 17 men surfaced.
Wait, 17 in one weekend?
17 individuals drove to a random physical address in Bethpage, Long Island, based entirely on a text-based chat.
That density is just, it's the critical takeaway from the Bethpage sting for me. It wasn't one outlier who obsessively tracked someone down over 6 months. It was 17 men in a single weekend.
It exposed an immediate, terrifying concentration of predatory intent hiding just beneath the surface of everyday suburban life.
But the logistical reality of managing 17 suspects in a house with no police is pure chaos. I mean, there is a moment described in the interview that perfectly captures this.
Oh, the dining room table scene.
Yes. The crew is sitting around a dining room table. They have all these printed AOL chat transcripts, literal stacks of printer paper mixed up. A suspect walks in and sits down. The interviewer comes out with a stack of papers and starts reading, It says here you wanted to do X, Y, and Z with a 13-year-old girl named Susie.
And the guy is just clueless.
Right. The guy sitting there just looks bewildered and says, no, that's not me.
It's a surreal intersection of administrative failure and criminal confrontation.
The interviewer has to excuse himself, walk back into the dining room, shuffle through the papers, grab a second set of transcripts, and go back out. Okay, you said this. No, that's still not me. He has to go back a third time to finally match the right printed chat log to the physical human being sitting in the chair.
It's like a dark comedy.
It really is. Meanwhile, the pacing of arrivals is so fast that they are shoving their security guard into the basement and telling him not to speak or move because the next guy's already walking up the driveway.
And then there's the Eastern European man.
Oh my gosh, yes. At one point, an Eastern European man walks in, sees the hidden cameras, the scattered crew, the bizarre, tense atmosphere, and he literally assumes he has walked into a snuff film kill zone. He thinks he's about to be murdered.
The irony is that despite the massive exposure, out of those 17 men, almost all of them just stood up, walked out the door, got into their cars, and drove away.
Because there were no cops to stop them.
Right. There were no immediate legal consequences because there was no police apparatus built into the operation to process them.
Hey, hold on. Let me jump in here. They just took the knives out of the drawer. That's the whole security plan.
Oh.
You have guys waiting outside in cars next to each other, mixed up transcripts, a guy who thinks he's in a torture chamber, and absolutely zero police backup to make an arrest.
It was incredibly bare bones.
That sounds completely insane and honestly borderline negligent. It sounds like a tech startup pushing a minimum viable product out the door just to see if it breaks. Isn't it wildly reckless to handle potential felons this way?
Well, the minimum viable product analogy is exactly the right lens for this. From a modern tactical standpoint, yes, it was incredibly raw and carried massive physical risk.
I mean, someone could have gotten killed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you have to view this through the sociological context of 2004. Why was this chaotic, unpoliced theater necessary? Because the justice system is inherently reactive. Law enforcement at the time treated the internet as a novelty space, not a crime scene requiring physical deployment.
So they basically had to force their hand.
Exactly. Cybercrimes existed, but the concept of proactive physical world stings generated by civilian chat logs was not an institutionalized strategy. This raw period was the necessary shock to the system.
Right. The television broadcasts acted as a cultural battering ram.
It visually proved to local police departments and the public that the threat was vastly larger and closer than they estimated. It forced the system to partner up and build the tactical protocols we use today.
Okay, so it was the catalyst. It forced the physical and digital worlds to collide in the eyes of the law. Because out of those 17 men, there was one glaring exception to the rule of just walking away. A New York City firefighter.
Yes, the one who didn't get away.
He was the only one investigated and prosecuted by the FBI from that weekend. And the mechanics of why him and not the others is fascinating. Out of the chaos, he was the only one where they could positively identify his full name and the specific firehouse in Brooklyn where he worked.
Which gave them actual leverage.
Right. They confronted him after the fact, on camera, outside of the sting house. He admitted to it, and the feds finally had an actionable, neatly packaged case. He took a plea bargain and left the fire department.
It perfectly illustrates the false sense of absolute anonymity that defined the early internet. These perpetrators believed the digital realm was a consequence-free vacuum, entirely severed from their physical lives, their careers, and the justice system.
But the moment you strip away that digital screen and demand a physical meeting, you introduce immense real-world volatility, and that volatility is what I really want to dig into next.
Because it changes everything.
It does. Crossing that threshold from typing on a keyboard to turning the doorknob of a suburban house changes the threat matrix completely.
It takes the crime from a theoretical digital grooming phase to a kinetic physical threat. And the historical record from these operations details exactly how quickly that kinetic threat materializes once the fantasy breaks into the real world.
Let's look at an investigation in Livingston Parish, Louisiana. A 19-year-old guy walks into a sting house. He has been chatting online about making a pornographic video with a girl he believes is underage.
And watch how fast he escalates.
Right. He walks in, fully confident, and immediately attempts to physically close the distance. He goes right up to the decoy, who is actually a young, undercover sheriff's deputy, and tries to initiate physical contact, offering a big hug.
The psychological barrier to physical contact has already been dismantled in his mind through the chat logs. The escalation is immediate upon entry.
He sits down, and the interrogation begins. For 25 to 30 minutes, he sits there and lies. He swears up and down he has never done this before, he wasn't really going to do anything, he just wanted to talk.
Standard denial playbook.
Exactly. He sticks to his narrative of innocence. Finally, law enforcement enters and takes him away. Standard procedure. But then, they search the backpack he physically carried into the house with him.
And this is the moment where the abstract digital crime becomes lethally concrete.
At the bottom of that backpack, underneath his personal items, they find condoms and a loaded .38 caliber pistol with a full clip.
A loaded .38. Just think about that.
And this forces a terrifying series of mechanical questions, right? What if the cameras weren't running? What if he was actually alone with a 14-year-old girl who suddenly got scared and decided she didn't want to cooperate with making a video? What if she resisted?
Does he pull that gun to force compliance?
Does he use it to silence her? Bringing a .38 caliber handgun to a meeting with a child is not an abstract concept. It is a tool for enforcing a monopoly on violence in a space where he knows he is breaking the social contract.
And it creates an incredibly complex legal situation. In states with liberal carry laws, simply possessing that firearm isn't necessarily a standalone crime until it is brandished or used in the commission of a felony.
But its presence dictates the lethal potential of the encounter.
Absolutely. He brought the means to ensure his fantasy was executed regardless of the victim's compliance.
And it's not an isolated incident at all. There is another detailed sting in Alabama. A suspect is sitting in the kitchen being questioned. He is not acting overtly threatening, he's just answering the questions calmly.
Just having a conversation.
Suddenly, a police lieutenant who is monitoring the hidden cameras from a back room notices an unnatural bulge in the suspect's clothing. He bursts into the kitchen, orders the guy to put his hands up, and asks if he has a weapon.
And the guy just casually reaches into his pants.
Pulls out a massive .45 caliber handgun and sets it right on the kitchen counter, barrel pointed toward the crew.
These events shatter the illusion that digital grooming is a nonviolent offense. The leap from typing a message to carrying a .45 caliber handgun into a stranger's home demands that we analyze the neurobiology and the psychology of who exactly is taking that step.
We really need to look at the psychological profiles.
Yeah, the historical data outlines a framework that breaks these perpetrators down into 3 distinct operational categories.
Let's break those down because they really challenge the Hollywood stereotype of, the unhinged stranger hiding in an alleyway.
The first category is the hardcore chronic offender. These individuals are deeply entrenched in predatory behavior as a core facet of their identity. The internet is merely a convenient logistical tool for them, but they are not dependent on it.
So they'd be doing this anyway.
Exactly. They would offend with or without broadband access. They are the ones actively seeking access to children in physical spaces, malls, movie theaters, youth sports organizations. Their drive is pathological, pervasive, and highly recidivist.
Okay, then you have the second category, the young opportunists. These are the 19, 20, 21-year-old guys. And their operational psychology relies heavily on a deeply flawed cognitive distortion.
Right. It's not really a crime defense.
Yes. They tell themselves, well, if she's willing, it's not really a crime. Because the age gap between a 20-year-old and a 15-year-old doesn't feel like a massive generational chasm to them. They minimize the predation. They view it as a slightly taboo social interaction rather than a felony.
Which is a profound miscalculation of neurodevelopmental power dynamics and rigid legal boundaries. The trauma inflicted on a 15-year-old victim is identical regardless of the 20-year-old perpetrator's internal rationalizations.
Yeah.
The law does not care about your perception of maturity.
But I want to challenge the second category a bit. I struggle with the label young opportunist.
How so?
Well, there is an anecdote about a documentary where an 18-year-old was caught trying to meet a 15-year-old, and his mother was furious at the police because the arrest meant her son couldn't go to his high school graduation.
She blamed the cops.
Exactly. Are we as a society using age as a toxic excuse? Calling them opportunists almost sounds forgiving. When you look at the mechanics of what they're doing, it looks much more like a fatal addiction.
That's a strong word, addiction.
But think about it. These guys know the risks. There is an established 20% chance they are walking into a law enforcement trap. They literally joke about it in the chat logs.
Oh, right, the guy in Louisiana.
Yes, one suspect in Louisiana even referenced a previous, highly publicized sting operation that the local sheriff had conducted. He acknowledged he knew he might get caught, and he still got into the hot tub at the decoy house. Knowing an action could result in decades in prison, knowing it destroys your life, and doing it anyway. How is that just being an opportunist? That is an overriding, fatal compulsion.
You're identifying the exact mechanics of addiction there. The neurological drive to fulfill the fantasy completely overrides common sense, self-preservation, and basic executive function.
It just shorts out their brain.
Right. But if we try to isolate why does that addiction form in the first place? The psychiatric reality is incredibly complex and often unsatisfying. Society desperately wants a monolithic answer.
We want an easy fix.
Exactly. We want to point to a single cause so we can mandate a single cure, lock them up forever, implement medical castration, or run them through a 12-week cognitive behavioral therapy program so they emerge, quote-unquote, cured.
But it's never that simple.
No, the reality is a fragmented web. For a portion of these individuals, the behavior is deeply rooted in their own childhood trauma. It is a tragic, cyclical repetition of abuse where they attempt to reclaim power by doing what was done to them. For others, however, there is absolutely zero history of abuse. There is just a dark rewiring of their desires through environmental exposure or a congenital lack of empathy.
Which brings us to the third category, the middle group. And this is perhaps the most unsettling demographic because they're fully integrated into society.
These are the people you see every day.
Right. These are the professionals, men in their 30s, 40s, 50s. Doctors, lawyers, utility linemen, accountants. They possess these urges, but normally they possess the executive function to keep them in check. They operate perfectly well in the community.
Until they don't.
Until they don't. But over time, through the mechanism of the internet, they're able to isolate themselves and indulge in the fantasy so frequently and so deeply that the digital realm is no longer enough. The fantasy eventually demands kinetic, physical fulfillment.
It's a gradual escalation of threshold. And if we connect this to the broader picture of neurobiology, this professional group perfectly illustrates how impulse control is systematically eroded by consumption. There is an undeniable mechanical link between the consumption of child sexual abuse material CSAM and the eventual commission of real-world offenses.
The correlation is absolute. Consuming that material is not a passive, victimless crime. Aside from the obvious horror that a child was actively abused to create the image in the first place, the act of viewing it acts as a neurological engine.
It primes them for action.
It wires the viewer's brain toward action. It fuels a cycle that ultimately demands a real-world victim.
And we have to analyze how the modern technological environment exacerbates this. If you look at the 1970s or 80s, accessing comparatively mild contraband required physical effort, risk of social exposure, and logistical hurdles.
You had to go to a physical place.
Exactly. Today, a few keystrokes on a smartphone deliver hyper-aggressive, extreme material instantaneously and anonymously. This frictionless accessibility fundamentally rewires the brain's dopamine reward pathways. It desensitizes the individual.
So they need more to feel the same high.
Over months and years, the brain requires increasingly extreme stimuli to achieve the baseline neurological reward. Eventually, viewing a screen is no longer sufficient. The only way to trigger the dopamine release is to cross the threshold into physical offending.
Wow. And before we leave this analysis of psychology, we have to address a major cultural blind spot, the double standard regarding female perpetrators.
This is such an important point.
Think about the headlines we see constantly: female teachers caught with young male students. Culturally, society often minimizes this. People make jokes about it being a teenage boy's dream come true.
Which is incredibly damaging.
It really is, because the psychological damage inflicted on the victim is exactly the same. The difference lies entirely in the tactics. Male predators generally rely on the vast anonymity of the internet to hunt strangers. Female predators, conversely, tend to operate within established social structures.
They look for convenience and trust.
Right. They seek out victims they already know, a student in their classroom, a neighbor, a family friend, where they have already established a position of trust, power, and authority.
It forces us to recognize that abuse, at its core, is fundamentally about the exploitation of a power dynamic, regardless of the gender of the perpetrator or the specific environment in which it occurs.
And speaking of environments, while some perpetrators exploit the trust of a classroom or the obscurity of a suburban sting house, others operate on an entirely different echelon.
They build their own reality.
They use immense resources to build entirely new environments where the laws of society simply do not penetrate, which leads us out of the suburbs and into the world of weaponized wealth.
We are shifting from chaotic dining room tables in Long Island to private islands, corporate boardrooms, and impenetrable walls of influence.
We have to examine the Jeffrey Epstein network. And just to lay the groundwork, we are going to be discussing the factual presence of highly prominent political figures and titans of industry, as mentioned in the source material. We are looking at this purely through the lens of architectural impunity.
Right, purely reporting on the mechanics.
Yes, exactly. We are not taking sides or endorsing any political views. We just want to understand. How do you build a system that allows you to traffic human beings in plain sight?
Because the Epstein case is not just a study in deviance. It is a masterclass in systemic sociological manipulation. The core pathology of the crime, the need to exploit vulnerability, is identical to the suburban predator we just discussed.
But the environment is entirely different.
Wealth doesn't change the sickness. It simply finances its camouflage.
Let's dissect how he built that camouflage, starting from the ground up. He didn't start as a billionaire. He started by aggressively lying on his resume to gain a foothold in finance at Bear Stearns.
He literally faked his credentials.
Claimed academic degrees he did not possess. And when the lie was eventually discovered by his superiors, instead of being fired and blacklisted, he manipulated his boss. He leaned into a persona saying, "Look, I learned on the streets, I have a hard knocks education, and more importantly, I am making you money."
And they bought it.
They let him stay. The New York Times eventually interviewed his former boss, who expressed deep regret for not killing his career right then and there. But Epstein learned a fundamental lesson in that moment. If you produce value for powerful people, the structural rules of society do not apply to you.
That realization is the bedrock of his impunity. He lied, manipulated, and networked his way into proximity with massive generational wealth. And once he established that proximity, he began extracting staggering amounts of leverage.
The prime mechanism for this was his relationship with billionaire Les Wexner, the retail titan behind Victoria's Secret. The level of control Epstein extracted is baffling. Wexner gave Epstein total, sweeping power of attorney over his personal finances.
Which is almost unheard of.
Think about what that legally means. Epstein could sign documents, move capital, and execute contracts on behalf of a billionaire without oversight. And it culminated in Wexner essentially handing over the deed to the largest single residential property in Manhattan, a massive Upper East Side townhouse, to Epstein for the sum of $10. $10 for a palace.
You have to ask the mechanical question. Why does a seasoned billionaire hand over unprecedented legal control and a monumental real estate asset to a man who is actively running an international trafficking ring?
It's just wild.
Epstein utilized his proximity to Wexner's empire, specifically the allure and power dynamics of the modeling industry, to globally traffic young women and girls from Eastern Europe, Russia, and Asia. He integrated his predatory behavior seamlessly into his business operations.
And the way they communicated to manage the logistics of this trafficking is chilling. The historical record includes emails released in the legal files, widely known as the beef jerky emails. Let's look at the exact mechanics of this correspondence.
This part is so disturbing.
On December 21st, 2012, an email is sent from someone named Steve Hansen to an associate on the island. The subject line is simply, "jerky recipe." It reads, "Jay is requesting the latest beef jerky recipe as Jay has asked her to try and make some. He says the last batch that you made tasted different. Would it be possible to forward us the recipe?"
If you look at it without context, it mimics the banality of a mundane administrative request.
But the context makes it horrifying. Listen to the reply. I've now been told it is the old way Francis was doing it he likes best and not the latest batch. So on Little St. James is going to try and do it that way. I am in Europe, but with him on the island if you need to call Elias about getting anything down.
They're using corporate
Okay.
speak.
They go on to discuss refrigeration, weight, and storage. Anyone reading this with an ounce of critical thinking knows they are not discussing the culinary preservation of dried meat. It is blatant code.
And the use of that code signifies the absolute normalization of depravity within his operational circle. They reduced human beings to commodities, managing the logistics of abuse with the casual, detached language of ordering catering for a corporate retreat.
It's disgusting.
It is a level of objectification that requires stripping away all empathy.
And the reality of what happened to those commodities is nightmarish. Consider the account of Julia Bryant, an Epstein survivor. She describes the initial phases of grooming, which relied heavily on the illusion of safety created by elite proximity.
Right, the halo effect.
Exactly. She recounts meeting Epstein during a trip to South Africa around 2002. Epstein is traveling with an entourage that includes former President Bill Clinton, actor Kevin Spacey, and a detail of Secret Service agents.
Which, again, we're just reporting facts from the source regarding his travel companions to show the illusion of safety he built.
Yes, exactly. So Julia is a young woman trying to navigate the modeling world. She looks at this environment and makes a completely logical assumption. How much safer can I possibly be? This man is traveling internationally with the former president of the United States and federal agents.
It is the ultimate form of camouflage. Proximity to absolute institutional power creates a psychological halo effect. The victim's internal alarm bells are silenced because they assume the presence of such high-profile figures guarantees a safe environment.
But that halo effect was a trap. She is eventually coerced into traveling to Epstein's Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, and the details she shares about her time there stops you cold.
It's truly terrifying.
She recounts waking up in what appeared to be a fully equipped surgical suite. There are people walking around in medical scrubs. She has no memory of the preceding hours, no visible surgical scars, but she regains consciousness on a medical table inside a billionaire's private compound.
This specific detail introduces a deeply disturbing, though speculative, parallel to the operations of another disgraced billionaire, Peter Nygard.
Right, let's unpack that parallel. Nygard was a fashion mogul running massive trafficking operations out of his compound in the Bahamas. Investigative documentaries have alleged that Nygard's ultimate goal extended beyond sexual abuse. He was allegedly obsessed with life extension, a perverse quest for the fountain of youth.
The stem cell allegation.
Yeah. The allegations are that he would impregnate young women, coerce them into having abortions, and harvest the stem cells to inject into his own body. Now, to be clear, there is no definitive proof that Epstein was engaged in that specific type of biomedical harvesting at Zorro Ranch.
No, it's speculative.
But when a survivor explicitly details waking up in a covert surgical suite, you're forced to ask, what were the actual boundaries of depravity among these interconnected elites?
Exactly. And this brings me to a crucial point about how Epstein maintained this empire for so long. There's an analogy here that I think perfectly explains the mechanics of his power. Survivors have detailed how Epstein would traffic them to other powerful men in finance, academia, or Hollywood. Epstein himself wouldn't even be in the room. But immediately afterward, he would call the victim, and he would demand granular, agonizing details of the sexual assault.
He wanted a play-by-play.
He wanted to know exactly what the man did, what he said, what his specific preferences were. He collected this data obsessively. It reminds me of an elite sports coach meticulously studying game tape. But he isn't studying the tape to improve a team's performance.
He's building an arsenal.
He's studying the tape to build an impenetrable vault of blackmail over the masters of the universe. He took their darkest, most illegal secrets and weaponized them to secure his own absolute invincibility.
It is the architecture of extortion economics. By meticulously documenting the moral and legal compromises of incredibly powerful men, he essentially minted his own currency of impunity. He created a structural reality where prosecuting him meant risking the exposure of the entire elite power structure itself.
The system was incentivized to protect him to protect itself.
And we saw the devastating result of this weaponized legal dynamic in 2008, the infamous sweetheart deal. Let's look at the mechanics of how the justice system was bent to accommodate him.
The initial federal investigation into Epstein yielded allegations involving at least 43 victims' girls who were 12, 13, and 14 years old. Under normal circumstances, this is a massive federal trafficking case that results in decades in a maximum security prison.
But that's not what happened.
Instead, his high-powered legal defense team negotiated a non-prosecution agreement, or NPA. Now, normally, an NPA is used to protect a low-level cooperating witness who helps the government take down a kingpin. Here, they warped the legal instrument to protect the kingpin himself, and crucially, it included language protecting his unindicted co-conspirators.
Unbelievable. He ends up serving just 12 to 13 months in a county jail in Florida, and the conditions of that confinement were a joke. He was granted work release, meaning he was allowed to leave the jail 6 days a week, go to his private office from 9:00 a.m. to 5:00 p.m., and run his empire before returning to a private wing of the jail to sleep.
It wasn't even real prison.
He essentially pled guilty to a state charge of soliciting prostitution, which deliberately obscured the reality of a massive, coercive international trafficking organization by framing it as a local guy hiring girls for massages.
And what is vital to understand is the aftermath. He did not use this wrist slap as a moment of rehabilitation. He did not retreat from society. He went right back to operating his network, arguably with more brazenness than before, because he had successfully tested the limits of the justice system and won.
And high society let him right back in.
Prominent academics, business leaders, and royals continued to attend his dinners and accept his funding, fully knowing he was a registered sex offender. There is an anecdote regarding Prince Andrew, who allegedly told authorities when questioned about his associations, "I'm the Queen's son, you can't do this to me."
They all thought they were untouchable.
They all shared a collective reinforced delusion that the structural laws governing the rest of humanity simply did not apply to them.
The legal system was completely paralyzed by his leverage. It required an external force to tear it down. It required the relentless, years-long chipping away by local journalism, specifically the work of Julie K. Brown at the Miami Herald, to finally pierce that armor in 2019.
It wasn't the system fixing itself.
No! It wasn't the DOJ waking up one day and deciding to do the right thing. It was investigative journalism forcing the justice system to acknowledge the bodies they had helped bury a decade earlier.
Which demonstrates that sunlight is the only effective disinfectant when dealing with systemic elite impunity. But as we move forward into the timeline, we have to recognize that the camouflage has evolved again.
Right. They don't need private islands anymore.
The predators of today don't necessarily need a private island or billions of dollars to hide their operations. They're using an entirely different, highly accessible ecosystem.
Which brings us to a battlefield that is arguably the most insidious because it doesn't look like a threat. It looks like a toy. It is sitting in the living room, on the iPad, in the hands of children as young as 5 years old. We are talking about the digital camouflage of modern video games, specifically Roblox.
And we must define the scale and mechanics of this platform. Roblox is not just a single linear game like Super Mario. It is a multi-tiered, multi-billion-dollar, publicly traded gaming platform based in San Mateo, California.
It's a whole universe.
It's a game creation system that allows users to design their own games, build entirely new virtual worlds, and interact with millions of other players simultaneously. It is a sprawling digital universe. And while it undeniably fosters incredible creativity and community, the sheer scale of unmonitored interaction has allowed it to harbor a dark, 15-year history of adults exploiting the platform's mechanics to groom children.
Let's talk about the human cost of that 15-year history. There is a story that exemplifies the extreme psychological toll this takes. A 10-year-old boy named Shlee. He was a Roblox prodigy, a highly skilled player, and a well-known creator within the platform's community.
But his prominence made him a target.
Yes. He was methodically groomed and abused by an older creator who leveraged a power dynamic within the game's social hierarchy. The abuse was so psychologically devastating that this 10-year-old boy became actively suicidal and had to be hospitalized.
But Shlee's trajectory takes a remarkable turn. He survives the hospitalization, and with the intense support of his parents, he decides to weaponize his deep knowledge of the platform's architecture. He dedicates his life to hunting and exposing predators within the game.
And his efforts have uncovered a systemic failure. Shlee is now represented by a legal firm that began exploring action against Roblox on behalf of victims. Initially, they had roughly 500 cases of individuals claiming the platform failed to protect them from predation.
Which is already a huge number.
But within a matter of months, that number exploded to 3,000 cases. 3,000 potential legal actions against a single corporate entity alleging a catastrophic failure of duty of care.
And the threat vectors on these platforms are not limited to lone individuals seeking sexual gratification. The platform has been infiltrated by highly organized, ideologically driven networks.
Let's look at the 764 group. This is a deeply disturbing, nihilistic organization operating across multiple gaming and social platforms. Their primary objective isn't traditional sexual exploitation, it is psychological destruction and the generation of chaos.
They want to break these kids.
They actively target vulnerable children, isolate them, and coerce them into acts of extreme self-harm, going so far as to manipulate them into live streaming suicide attempts for the group's entertainment.
The cruelty is engineered. There is an account from a father whose daughter was co-opted by members of 764 on Roblox. She ultimately died by suicide. But the mechanics of the group's malice dictate that the operation doesn't end with the victim's death.
What do they do next?
They systematically began harassing the grieving father online after his daughter's suicide, solely to inflict maximum emotional pain and assert dominance over the family.
It is an ecosystem of pure abuse, operating seamlessly alongside children building digital houses. But 764 isn't the only threat vector on these platforms. While nihilistic groups are hunting for psychological destruction, there is an entirely separate network operating right beside them that is hunting strictly for cash.
The extortion rings.
Let's talk about the mechanics of international sextortion rings.
This is a threat that specifically targets adolescent males. The mechanic relies on exploiting the biological and social vulnerabilities of the teenage brain.
Right, a teenage boy is playing a game or scrolling social media. He receives a message from an account presenting as an attractive young woman. They start chatting. The conversation quickly turns flirtatious, and the woman suggests they trade compromising photos. The boy complies.
And that's when the trap closes.
The moment he hits send, the trap snaps shut. It's not a young woman, it's a financial extortionist sitting in a boiler room in Nigeria or the Ivory Coast. They immediately drop the persona and demand money, often starting with $500 in untraceable gift cards.
And if he didn't pay?
They threaten that if he doesn't pay, they will send the explicit photos to his parents, his teachers, and everyone on his Instagram friends list. They explicitly tell him that his life is over and he should just kill himself. And tragically, because of how a 15-year-old processes social shame, many boys do exactly that rather than face the exposure.
Which brings us to the critical issue of corporate responsibility. How does a multi-billion-dollar entity like Roblox, which profits immensely from user engagement, respond to thousands of grooming allegations, the presence of nihilistic suicide cults, and international extortion rings operating on their servers?
According to the historical record, their response is to deploy the corporate shield. They are willing to conduct background briefings where their chief security officer, Matt Kaufman, provides technical data to journalists off the record.
But they won't go on camera.
Right. When asked to sit down for a rigorous on-camera interview to answer direct questions about systemic failures, they flatly refuse. They prefer to give interviews in friendly, tech-focused environments where the conversation revolves around daily active users, new avatar features, and metaverse expansion, rather than facing accountability for child safety.
And there is a specific mechanical policy decision that perfectly illustrates the tension between user safety and corporate profitability. Roblox is legally mandated to report suspected child exploitation. They utilize an API system to send back-end reports to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEZ, which then processes those tips and forwards them to relevant law enforcement agencies.
Okay, so they do report it.
Yes, but crucially, Roblox actively refuses to allow law enforcement to conduct proactive, undercover sting operations on their platform.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second. Is Roblox actually the villain in this specific policy decision? Or are they just the digital landlord of a city that is simply too massive to police without violating the rights of everyone who lives there?
The privacy argument.
Think about the massive legal battle between Apple and the FBI over the San Bernardino shooter's iPhone. Tim Cook refused to build a backdoor to unlock the phone because he argued, correctly, that once you build a mechanism to bypass privacy for the police, you destroy the privacy of every innocent user on Earth. Is Roblox just defending user privacy? If there are undercover cops roaming the servers, how does a kid know if they're playing a game with another 12-year-old or a 45-year-old detective in Florida? Doesn't that shatter the entire user experience?
The privacy argument is the standard, highly polished corporate defense. But we have to look past the PR and analyze the underlying economics. The fundamental tension here is between corporate engagement metrics and user safety.
Meaning friction costs money.
Exactly. Anything that creates friction on a platform, anything that makes users second-guess their interactions or hesitate to connect potentially lowers engagement. And lower engagement directly impacts quarterly earnings and stock prices. But from a purely law enforcement perspective, allowing proactive digital stings is mechanically essential because it creates a necessary chilling effect on predatory behavior.
Explain the mechanics of that chilling effect.
It is about introducing risk into the predator's calculus.
Mm.
Currently, predators operate with a high degree of confidence because they know the platform's terms of service prohibit proactive policing. But if a predator knows that any 12-year-old avatar they approach on a server might actually be an undercover detective building a federal case, it introduces massive paralyzing risk into their hunting ground.
It acts as a powerful deterrent.
Yes. By refusing to allow proactive policing, platforms maintain a frictionless, highly profitable environment for legitimate users, but they simultaneously provide a safe, unpoliced haven for groomers. They prefer the quiet, delayed back-end referrals to NCMEC because it fulfills their legal obligation without disrupting the user experience. But it fundamentally fails to deter the predator before the child is victimized.
And the long-term cost of that passive compliance is devastating. There is an interview with a man named Woody. He is 30 years old now, a military veteran. He deadlifts 716 pounds. He is a massive, physically imposing guy.
He was a victim.
And he broke down sobbing on camera, talking about how he was groomed and almost sexually assaulted by an older man he met on Roblox 15 years ago. A decade and a half later, the exact same mechanical vulnerabilities are still being exploited on the same platform.
The digital footprint left by these interactions is vast. Which brings us to a fascinating, double-edged reality. While the internet provides unprecedented, frictionless access for predators to hunt, we are simultaneously living in an era of unprecedented, inescapable surveillance. It is becoming increasingly difficult to completely vanish after committing a crime.
Because technology is not just the weapon, it is also the net. Let's examine how modern surveillance architecture works in practice. There is a high-profile case that doesn't involve digital grooming, but perfectly illustrates the sheer power of data tracking. The kidnapping of Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of television anchor Savannah Guthrie.
It's a case that, on its surface, is baffling. An elderly woman is taken from the home she has lived in for 50 years. The motive is murky. Was it a targeted attack due to her daughter's high-profile status, or a random home invasion gone wrong?
But the motive is less important than how law enforcement mechanically approaches a mystery like this today. They don't just canvass the neighborhood asking if anyone saw a suspicious van. They rely heavily on advanced AI and corporate surveillance integration.
Like the Walmart system.
Yes, consider Walmart's security infrastructure. If a suspect buys a specific combination of items, say a generic backpack and a surgical mask, Walmart's AI systems can instantly cross-reference millions of data points across thousands of stores to pinpoint exactly when and where those items were purchased together.
That's incredible.
They pull the timestamped video, cross-reference it with license plate readers in the parking lot, and reconstruct the suspect's digital ghost. It is the exact same mechanical tracking that caught the Idaho college killer, where authorities built an undeniable matrix of cell phone pings overlapping with disparate surveillance cameras across state lines.
The data field is enormous, but our search capabilities have evolved to match it. And this concept of a connected surveillance matrix extends globally, often manifesting in incredibly unpredictable, almost cinematic ways.
Unpredictable doesn't even begin to cover it. Let's detail an international operation in Cambodia that defies belief. Law enforcement partnered with an NGO called the International Justice Mission, or IJM. They targeted a brothel operating in a place called Svay, roughly 11 kilometers outside of Phnom Penh. The specific objective was to dismantle a network catering to Westerners engaging in child sex tourism,
which is a deeply entrenched, highly lucrative, and horrifying global industry that relies on exploiting impoverished regions.
The operation was textbook. They set up hidden cameras, posed as tourists, infiltrated the compound, and successfully rescued 37 girls. During the sting, they captured footage of an American doctor and anesthesiologist. He believed he was just bragging on a promotional tourism video, completely oblivious to the fact that he was being recorded admitting to his crimes.
And they got him later, right?
Law enforcement later tracked this doctor down and ambushed him with the footage in a concrete parking garage in Guam.
It is a massive operational success, but the true mechanical power of this sting wasn't realized until the footage was broadcast to the public.
The aftermath is where it gets absurd. The hidden camera footage from the Cambodian brothel is broadcast on network television in North America. Thousands of miles away, two police detectives in Vancouver, Canada, happened to be sitting in their respective living rooms watching the broadcast on a Tuesday night.
Just off duty watching TV.
They see the footage from inside the brothel. They call each other up and realize something incredible. The very specific, distinct wallpaper and background of that Cambodian brothel perfectly matches the background they saw on a seized VHS tape.
A tape they already had in evidence.
A tape that belonged to a suspect they currently had in custody in Vancouver for assaulting a local sex worker. They pulled the tape, cross-referenced the visual data with the television broadcast, and mathematically proved that their local suspect had also been traveling to Cambodia to abuse children. That realization secured a 7-year conviction.
That is just stunning.
Now, let's pause and look at the sheer absurdity of this outcome. A massive international human trafficking puzzle is solved, and a man is sent to prison simply because a Canadian cop decided to watch the right TV show on a Tuesday night. I have to ask, are we relying too much on dumb luck rather than building actual systemic justice?
It is very tempting to label that sequence of events as dumb luck. But we have to reframe what luck actually is in the context of modern information systems. Luck in this scenario is the direct mechanical byproduct of extreme public awareness.
You mean creating the conditions for luck to happen?
Exactly. That Vancouver conviction would never have materialized without the exhaustive, highly visible journalism that exposed the brothel in the first place. When you expose these dark corners to millions of people, whether through AI-driven surveillance netting or through mass-market television broadcasts, you exponentially increase the surface area for justice to occur.
So you're crowdsourcing the investigation.
You force the system to act because you are actively distributing the missing puzzle pieces to thousands of people who didn't even know they were looking for them.
But sometimes, throwing a spotlight on those dark corners reveals uncomfortable truths about cultural complexities that we cannot easily fix with an arrest warrant or a television broadcast. The historical record includes conversations with elite military operators, Navy SEALs, Army...
And what they saw was horrifying.
They report witnessing deeply ingrained cycles of systemic child abuse. But it wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was operating openly, often involving powerful warlords and the exploitation of child soldiers.
It points to regions where the cycle of victimization is multi-generational. It is structurally normalized and protected within certain tribal factions. This forces a deeply uncomfortable philosophical and tactical conversation.
How do you even fight that?
How do you mechanically combat abuse when it is not viewed as individual criminal deviance, but is instead protected by the cultural power structures of the region? It's a bleak reality that underscores the overwhelming global magnitude of the problem.
And it is incredibly heavy. We have traversed a massive dark landscape today. We've gone from the chaotic origins of Long Island dining rooms to the surgical suites of billionaire compounds, to the digital battlegrounds of kids' games, to the complex cultural realities of war zones.
We really need to bring this back home.
Yes, we need to empower the listener. How do you actually defend your own home against this constantly mutating virus?
The tactical advice provided by experts is not reliant on buying expensive software. It relies on establishing rigid behavioral mechanics within the household. And the first mechanism is geographic control of technology. Keep all digital devices out of the bedroom at night. No exceptions.
There's a story about a dad from the early days of online gaming, back during the peak of World of Warcraft. His son wanted to stay up late playing on the family computer, which was located in the living room. The son argued that he couldn't log off because he couldn't let the fellas down during a raid.
And what did the dad do?
The dad simply looked at him and said, "Bedtime is bedtime. There will be more fellas tomorrow." Today, the technology is highly mobile. It's in their pockets. But the geographic boundary must remain absolute. The bedroom is a private space, and predators require unmonitored privacy to establish the grooming dynamic.
Furthermore, parents must actively involve themselves in the mechanics of the platforms their children use. You must monitor the chat functions on games like Roblox. You have to actively limit the exposure vectors.
But we also have to be realistic, right?
Oh, definitely. Technological guardrails will inevitably fail. Kids are smart, they will find workarounds, or they will access devices outside the home. Therefore, the psychological guardrails are far more important than the technological ones.
And building those psychological guardrails starts on day one. The moment a child is handed a device with internet access, the parent must have a very blunt conversation. You look them in the eye and say, there are adults online who actively want to trick you.
You don't have to scare them with the graphic details.
No, you do not have to explain the horrific, graphic details of sexual exploitation to an 8-year-old, but you absolutely must establish the concept of digital deception immediately. Kids fundamentally hate being tricked or manipulated. By framing it this way, you build a natural, defensive skepticism into their baseline approach to the internet.
But skepticism alone isn't enough to prevent every mistake. Adolescents are biologically wired to take risks. And this leads to the most critical mechanical piece of advice for parents. You must proactively create an environment of total amnesty.
Let me use an analogy here to explain why amnesty is so crucial. Parenting a teenager in the digital age is exactly like dropping them into a sprawling, chaotic metropolis with no street signs, no traffic lights, and no map. They are going to take a wrong turn. They are going to get
It's
lost.
inevitable.
If you tell them, listen, if you ever get lost in this city, I'm taking away your car forever, what are they going to do when they inevitably end up in a dangerous neighborhood? They are going to hide. They will be too terrified of your punishment to call for help.
You have to promise them help without consequence.
You have to promise them explicitly that if they call for a tow truck, they will not get grounded. You have to create an environment where a kid can confess to making a massive mistake, like sending a compromising photo to a stranger, without the paralyzing terror of having their phone and internet access permanently revoked.
Because if we break down the neurobiology of the teenage brain, we understand why that promise of amnesty is literally a matter of life and death. When a 15-year-old boy is facing a sextortion threat from a Nigerian boiler room, his brain does not process the situation as a temporary, embarrassing mistake.
It processes it as the end of the world.
It processes the threat as a literal end-of-life scenario. A teenager's entire social ecosystem, their ego, their identity, it is all intricately bound to their digital footprint. When an extortionist threatens to expose them to their peers, the teenage brain catastrophizes entirely. Their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. They cannot see past the next 24 hours. They do not possess the life experience to realize that in 2 weeks, the news cycle will move on and nobody will care.
There is an incredibly powerful approach to this mentioned in the historical record. A South Carolina state legislator named Brandon Guffey tragically lost his son to suicide due to sextortion. He now travels the country speaking to high school students, and his message is intentionally jarring.
What does he tell them?
He tells them, look, your junk is probably already out there on the internet somewhere and nobody cares.
Mm.
It sounds crude, but it is a highly calculated mechanical psychological tactic. It is designed to instantly puncture that bubble of catastrophic, paralyzing shame.
Exactly. Parental trust. A calm, non-reactive response to a crisis. And the absolute promise of help without extreme punitive measures are the exact circuit breakers needed to interrupt the panic response and prevent tragedies. And parents also need to know that there are mechanical solutions available once the clearness is communicated.
Like reaching out to organizations that can help.
The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has resources specifically designed to interface with tech companies to scrub coerced images from servers. The situation is never hopeless, but the system can only work if the child feels safe enough to ask for the lifeline.
Let's bring this deep dive to a close. We have been on an incredible, frankly exhausting journey today, tracking the evolution of a highly adaptable threat. We started by looking at the raw, analog origins of catching predators, a retired cop's house in Long Island, a dining room table covered in mixed-up AOL transcripts, and the sudden realization that digital fantasies carry lethal physical consequences, like a loaded .38 caliber pistol in a backpack.
We analyzed the mechanics of elite impunity. We looked at how Jeffrey Epstein manipulated Wall Street, leveraged power of attorney over billionaires, and communicated through the horrific normalized code of the beef jerky emails, building a vault of blackmail that paralyzed the justice system for over a decade.
We confronted the digital camouflage of today. We examined how platforms like Roblox, a multi-billion-dollar corporation, host complex grooming ecosystems where 10-year-old victims are forced to become hunters, and nihilistic groups coerce teenagers into unimaginable harm, all while corporate economics prioritize frictionless engagement over proactive policing.
We looked at the vast surveillance nets catching kidnappers and the sheer power of public awareness that allows Canadian cops to solve international sex tourism cases just by watching TV.
And finally, we brought it back to the mechanics of your living room. Keeping devices out of the bedroom, establishing digital skepticism on day one, and promising absolute amnesty when your kid gets lost in the digital city.
It is a vast, intimidating landscape. But the ultimate takeaway is that while the virus continues to mutate, while predators constantly adapt their methods using immense wealth or cutting-edge technology, the ultimate countermeasure remains remarkably constant and accessible.
It's about staying vigilant.
It requires unwavering public awareness. It requires open, non-judgmental communication within families to break the leverage of shame. And above all, it requires the collective courage to simply refuse to look away, no matter how uncomfortable the reality becomes.
We cannot look away, and I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over as you go about your day. We learned today that an international predator was sent to prison simply because a detective halfway across the world noticed the background of a room on a television screen. As you navigate your own digital life, the games your family plays, the chat groups you scroll through, the seemingly innocent spaces you inhabit daily, what unseen backgrounds are you currently ignoring that might be hiding right in plain sight?